Hello and welcome to ICANN Media. I'm your host, Rob Hislop. Over the last couple of podcasts here at ICANN Media, we've been discussing a study that came out earlier this year, which states unequivocally that the oil sands industry is not increasing the level of pollution in the Athabasca River or Delta. As you can imagine, it certainly stirred up some controversy. In part one of this discussion, we spoke with one of the study's authors, that is Roland Hall from the University of Waterloo. Part two, we had a chance to chat with one of his critics, David Schindler. Well, today we're going to revisit Hall to get his response to some of Schindler's comments. So, Roland, just to recap for us, you do not think that the oil sands industry is having an impact on the water in the Athabasca region?
Yeah, I'm saying we can't detect it. Yeah, it's certainly not nothing. It's certainly not taking contaminants out of the system. I mean, it's a big industry, and it does emit some stuff to the air, and some of it will fall in the river, and some will fall on the adjacent land, and some of that material will fall into the river. But the river, it starts in the Rocky Mountains, travels something like 1,300 kilometers till it gets to where we were measuring it, to its end at the Athabasca Delta. And it picks up a lot of sediment, and some of it doesn't contain high levels of metals, and some of it doesn't contain high levels of other kinds of contaminants. And all of that, whatever's coming out in that stretch north of the oil sands industry is not enough to, from the industry, is not enough to bring the concentrations higher than they have been for centuries.
Well, what about people living in the area? What would you say to them, or does it just depend on whereabouts they're drawing their water from?
I can't. One of the things that we suggest in our study, in the publication that has just come out, is that we need to do this study closer to the industry as well, to see if there are localized effects that we can identify, even if there aren't the pollution that we can't detect further downstream. So I don't want to comment about to what extent, where, if you go closer to the industry, whether it's better or worse. But we do know that these metals, generally more than 90% of the metals is bound to the sediment that's carried in the river water. And that is a route of exposure for people, for animals. It's there naturally. I think another thing to point out is I don't want to cause people alarm that there's these massive levels of natural pollution. I mean, there's a source of natural pollution or natural contamination, but the concentrations that we measure in the sediments remain below threshold levels set by government agencies for protecting aquatic life and so on. So they're not that dangerous. They're probably lower than they would be in my front yard in Waterloo, Ontario, and the soils of an urban area and so on. So it's, I don't want to give the sense that it's a polluted area. The levels are not nothing, but and they're naturally high, but not terrible.
One of your critics, David Schindler, a respected scientist in his own right, who is certainly well known in these parts for his studies on fresh water and his efforts to protect water resources in northern Alberta, said a couple of things about your study. Now, one is that you have come to these conclusions before, and he suggests that the region you studied is simply too far away from the oil sands and not at all reflective of what's going on there.
I find the comment curious that, we've measured that, at the end of the river, and it's a very, very, 200 kilometers downstream of the industry, and that's too far away for anyone to expect to see an effect. That the Athabasca Delta, where we've studied, is to some extent an epicenter of the focal concerns around contaminants coming from oil sands. What we found at this location, I don't know that I can translate it to say that, it's going to represent what's happening if you take samples of the river bottom right next to the industry. That is work that has to be done yet. But certainly we're the first people who have developed a method to establish what the natural levels are so that we can start to make that comparison. We think this is a tool that will be very useful to regulators, industry people, government, and so on. This is a new published study. We haven't, it's a new twist, so it's not exactly, but we've come to similar conclusions when we've analyzed organic contaminants called PAHs.
So you have similar results in the studies that you've done. David Schindler obviously has similar results in the studies that he's done. Both of you completely opposite views on the impact of the oil sands industry. Tell me what you think the public should make of these differences.
Pollution from the oil sands is a polarized debate, all right? And communicating science to the general public through the media is a real challenge too. And so the result is that, it's tough on the public to make up their minds. Who do you believe? We have esteemed scientists on one side of the argument, and we have esteemed, credible scientists on the other side of the argument. I would argue that if you're going to evaluate how much the oil sands industry has polluted, you need to know for the Athabasca River what the natural levels were for the industry. That's your benchmark to figure out whether the levels that exist today are higher or not than they should be. And no one else has figured out a way to do this, all right? Dave Schindler did some really important studies that documented contaminant levels in the snowpack and documented that the contaminant levels downstream of the oil sands in the Athabasca River are higher than upstream of the oil sands. And all of that, kind of leads one to conclude that oil sands must be, it's kind of the straightforward conclusion from that, especially when you couple it with the kind of pictures that we see in the media of the smokestacks and the big devastation. How can that not be polluting, right? I mean, I see that too, right? And the thing is that I think sometimes we undervalue in certain locations the power of natural processes in distributing contaminants as well that naturally occur. Okay, we're mining bitumen because in Fort McMurray or near Fort McMurray because it lies near the surface. It's economical to get there, but that same reserve comes out into more than 100 river kilometers, and it erodes. And what we did, I mean, the science that's in our paper is all about being able to measure those concentrations of those contaminants and express them in a way that we can compare them to monitoring data that's been collected since in a systematic way and evaluate how much of an increase has happened.
Company that funded your research, and this is not at all something that you're trying to hide. It was mentioned in your media release. I'm just wondering, though, there will still be some people who think that Suncor just got the results that it would expect to get when it funds something, and they might think that your study is nothing more than a sham.
We got funding for this project in 2010, so almost 5 years ago. We did the field work in 2010. It took us, the project lasted about 2 years to 2012. And what we published in this study is the result of eureka moments we had after the project ended. And so this wasn't, sort of the essence of this paper is not part of the plan that we pitched to the oil sands industry where Suncor came and rose to the occasion and gave us the funding. So, and they never provided any input. This is really our ideas, following our best scientific skills and whatever to produce. So I hope those are arguments that people can listen to and say, hey, maybe we can trust this even though it was funded by Suncor.
Roland, let me thank you once more for your time.
Okay, you're welcome.
And that was Roland Hall, a professor at the University of Waterloo. He joined us via Skype. That brings to a close another edition of ICANN Media. I'm Rob Hislop.